Lover's Revenge. Dark Secrets of the Desert Kingdom. Hook. Trapped in a kingdom of darkness, haunted by shadows and the whispers of a lost love. This is a story of revenge, betrayal, and ultimate freedom. But what happens when the darkness isn't just a place, it's a part of you? Stay with me to the end, because the shocking twist will change everything you thought you knew. The wind howled across the desert, a constant whispering of sand against stone. The heat pressed against her skin, suffocating. She stumbled, her bare feet burning against the scorching earth. The horizon was empty, a vast stretch of nothingness. Her throat was dry, raw from the desert's relentless grip. She had been walking for hours, maybe days. Her eyes scanned the barren landscape, searching for something, anything. She had to find him. Her heart hammered in her chest, each beat a reminder of her purpose. The sun hung heavy in the sky, blinding in its intensity. The only sound was the crunch of sand underfoot and her labored breathing. Then she saw it, a dark shape in the distance. Her pulse quickened. Was it him? Her steps quickened, her body aching with each movement. But the closer she got, the more her hope began to wane. It was a ruin, a crumbling tower, ancient and forgotten. Her stomach twisted. This was the place he had promised her. Her fingers clenched, nails digging into her palms. She had come for him, but it wasn't just for love. It was for revenge. The wind kicked up again, swirling sand in her face. Her eyes watered, but she pushed forward. The ruins loomed closer now, dark and silent. She stepped inside, the air thick with dust and decay. There, in the center of the ruin, she saw a figure. Her breath caught in her throat. It was him, but not as she remembered. He was standing motionless, facing the wall, his body stiff, as if waiting for someone. She froze. "Why didn't you come for me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't respond. The silence stretched. She took another step. The ground beneath her feet groaned. Her heart skipped. The tower was unstable, but he wasn't moving. "Why?" she asked again, louder now. Still no answer. She stepped closer, her body trembling. Then a sharp noise, a click. The ground shifted beneath her. A trap. The earth gave way. She fell. Tumbling into the darkness swallowed her whole. She crashed into the cold stone floor below. Pain shot through her limbs. Her head throbbed. For a moment, everything was silent. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps. Her hands scraped the floor, searching for something to hold onto. A faint, flickering light appeared in the distance. She forced herself to stand, swaying. The walls around her seemed to close in, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and rot. Her heart pounded as she shuffled toward the light. With every step, the light grew brighter, casting long shadows on the walls. She reached the source, a torch. Its flame burned low, but enough to reveal the room ahead. Her eyes widened. The room was small, but it was lined with mirrors. Every surface reflected her image. She couldn't help but stare at herself, her disheveled hair, her torn clothes, her face streaked with dirt. But one reflection caught her off guard. It was him, his face, twisted in a grin, reflected in the glass beside her. She gasped, spinning around. Nothing. She turned back to the mirror. There it was again, his face, now twisted in anger. A chill ran down her spine. This wasn't right. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the mirrors pressing against her. She stepped back, her foot hitting something sharp. She cried out, stumbling, and fell against the cold stone again. Her hand brushed against the floor, feeling something smooth and wet. A pool of blood. Her breath caught. The reflection of him was there again. This time he wasn't smiling. His eyes were hollow, lifeless. And then he spoke. "Did you think it would be that easy?" His voice echoed, distant but clear. Her skin crawled. She backed away, her heart racing. The mirrors began to crack, splintering. The sound of breaking glass filled the air. Her legs gave way, and she sank to the floor. The room felt smaller now, suffocating. The mirrors continued to crack, the sound deafening. And then there was silence. But it wasn't over. She could still feel his presence, still hear his voice. Just behind her, her breath caught in her throat. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Then the whispers began, soft at first, barely audible. "You're too late," they hissed. Her body froze. She turned, her eyes wide, searching the shadows. Nothing. But the whispers grew louder, closer. The air turned icy, biting at her skin. A shadow moved at the corner of her vision. She spun around, heart racing. There he was, but he wasn't standing. He was kneeling, his back to her, facing a dark, open doorway at the far end of the room. The flickering light from the torch revealed only the back of his head, his dark hair matted with dirt. His clothes were torn, his body covered in scars. He was different, not the man she had loved, not the man she had come to find. "Why?" she whispered, her voice shaking. He didn't move. She took a step toward him. "Why didn't you come back for me?" Her voice cracked. Still, he didn't answer. Her fingers clenched into fists, frustration boiling inside her. She took another step, then another. She reached out, her hand trembling as it hovered over his shoulder. And then he moved. He turned sharply, his eyes hollow, empty. Her breath caught in her throat. His face was gaunt, as if the life had been drained from him. His lips parted, and in a low, rasping voice he spoke. "You shouldn't have come." His words were a warning, but she didn't stop. "Why did you leave me?" she demanded, her voice rising. His eyes glinted with something dark, something that didn't belong to the man she once knew. "You should have stayed away," he whispered, his voice now cold, distant. He stood slowly, his movements jerky, unnatural. The room seemed to grow colder still, the shadows thickening. "Run," he said, his voice a rasp, as though forced from a throat that hadn't spoken in years. Before she could move, the ground beneath her feet trembled. She stumbled, barely keeping her balance. The walls began to shift, slowly at first, then faster. The mirrors shattered, one by one, each crash echoing like thunder in the small, confined space. Her eyes darted around in panic. Something was happening. She didn't understand, but she knew it was too late to turn back. The air grew thick with dust and darkness, and then she saw it. A figure emerging from the shadows, tall, unmoving, a presence that sent a chill down her spine. Her blood turned to ice. It was coming for her. No escape, the figure stepped forward, its form shifting in the shadows like a living nightmare. Its presence pressed down on her chest, suffocating. She couldn't breathe. Her feet felt frozen, rooted to the spot. The figure's eyes gleamed in the dim light, void of any warmth. A low growl rumbled from its throat. The sound echoed in the space, vibrating through her bones. It moved closer, the ground beneath its feet cracking with each step. Her pulse hammered in her ears, drowning out everything else. Her body screamed to run, but her legs refused to obey. The air was thick with dread, as if the very walls were closing in on her. The figure loomed over her now, towering, monstrous. Its face was a blur of darkness, but there was something familiar about it. Her heart skipped. The figure reached out with long, clawed fingers. Without thinking, she finally moved. She bolted, her feet carrying her forward before she even realized it. But the ground beneath her gave way again. She screamed, the world spinning as she fell. The darkness swallowed her once more, the air thick and damp. She landed hard, the impact knocking the breath out of her lungs. Dazed, She gasped for air, trying to steady herself. The walls around her closed in tighter, the space now narrow and claustrophobic. She tried to push herself up, but her body felt heavy, exhausted. And then the whispering returned. "You're trapped," it hissed from all directions. Her breath quickened, panic seizing her chest. "You're never getting out," the voice echoed. She scrambled to her feet, desperate. The walls felt like they were pressing against her, narrowing with every passing second. Her fingers grazed the walls, searching for a way out. Her heart raced, and then she heard it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. The figure was close, too close. She spun around, eyes wide in terror. But there was nothing, only shadows. Her hand brushed against something hard, cold metal. A door. She pulled on it, her fingers slick with sweat. It wouldn't budge. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, panic clouding her mind. She looked up, and then she saw him. Not the figure. Him. The man she had come for. But he wasn't the man she remembered. His eyes were dark, hollow. His face was pale, lifeless. He smiled, but it wasn't a smile of love. It was a smile of something darker. "You should have never come here," he whispered, his voice low and haunting. The door behind her trembled, but it wouldn't open. She reached for him, but he stepped back, vanishing into the shadows. And then she heard it. The click of the door. It was opening. The door creaked slowly, the sound sharp and agonizing. Her heart hammered in her chest, the echo drowning out everything else. She stood frozen, the darkness closing in around her like a vice. A sliver of light spilled through the crack, faint but blinding in its sharp contrast. The door swung open wider, but she didn't move. Was it real? She didn't know. All she could hear was the blood rushing in her ears. The light beckoned, but fear held her back. A low hiss came from the shadows behind her. "Don't go," the voice murmured, its tone laced with venom. She turned slowly, feeling the hairs on her neck rise. The figure, no, him, was there again, standing in the darkness. His eyes glowed faintly, empty but hungry. She took a step back. "Why are you doing this?" Her voice trembled, barely a whisper. The smile on his face twisted, distorted, unnatural. "You came for me," he said, his voice dark and hollow. "But I've been waiting for you too long." She could feel the weight of his words crushing her. "Waiting," she choked, confusion rising in her throat. The room felt colder now, the air thick with something she couldn't name. He took a step toward her, his movements slow, deliberate. "You didn't know, did you?" he whispered. "What I became after you left." She stepped backward, her foot hitting something hard, the sensation jarring. Her fingers brushed the edge of the door, and she snapped her head to look. The doorway was there, just a few more steps. But something pulled at her, tethered her in place. The darkness, his eyes. She couldn't look away. "You think you can run?" he asked, his voice low, mocking. She wanted to scream, to fight, but all she could do was stand there, paralyzed. "You won't escape this place," he said, each word slow, deliberate. Her breath quickened, panic seizing her chest. The figure, ***, moved closer, faster now. His presence pressed on her, suffocating. The light from the open door seemed to fade, swallowed by the shadows that reached out from every corner. She was trapped. There was no escape. Then, a sudden sharp pain tore through her chest. She gasped, stumbling backward. Her hand shot to her heart, the pulse erratic, as though something was trying to tear its way out. She looked down. Blood. Thick, dark, pouring from a wound. A shadow, something sharp, glinting in the dim light. She blinked. The figure, ***, was holding something in his hand. A knife. The blade gleamed with dark intent. Her legs gave out, and she collapsed to the cold, unforgiving floor. The light from the door flickered. It was fading, and so was she. The darkness began to close in around her, the light from the door flickering weakly, as if it, too, was dying. Her chest heaved with every shallow breath, her vision blurring at the edges. The blood from the wound pooled beneath her, soaking into the stone floor. Her fingers trembled as they reached out, but the pain was unbearable. She tried to scream, but the sound was lost in the suffocating silence. The figure, ***, moved closer still, his presence crushing. His face was now fully visible, a twisted mask of hatred and sorrow. "You should have never come back," he whispered, his voice colder than the air around them. His eyes gleamed with something dark, something ancient. She wanted to reach for the door, to pull herself to safety, but her body wouldn't obey. Her legs refused to move, paralyzed by the agony and fear. The knife glinted in his hand, its blade sharp and wicked. "You thought you could change things," he murmured, "but there's no going back." Her mind raced, memories flooding in, her love for him, the betrayal, the broken promises. She had come for him, to find the man she had loved, to make him remember her. But now, as the blood poured from her, she realized that man was gone. Only this creature remained, the twisted reflection of everything that had once been. His lips parted, his breath coming in slow, deliberate gasps. The darkness around them grew deeper, darker. "I was lost," he said softly, almost pitying, "but you left me here alone." Her vision blurred completely now, the edges of her world dissolving into a hazy fog. She could feel her pulse slowing, the warmth draining from her limbs. The last thing she heard was his voice. "Now you'll join me." The knife was raised, poised above her chest, and for a fleeting moment she felt the cold metal against her skin. And then nothing. The light from the door flickered once more, casting a final, dying glow. And then it was gone. The room, the shadows, everything faded into absolute blackness. All that remained was silence. The silence was suffocating, pressing in from all sides. Time had stopped. There was no sound, no movement, just darkness. Her mind was a blur of broken thoughts, trying to grasp at anything at all. But nothing. Nothing made sense anymore. The cold from the knife still lingered in her chest, even though she couldn't feel her body. It was as though she was suspended, trapped between life and death. She tried to open her eyes, but it was useless. The blackness swallowed everything, and then movement. A whisper. It barely brushed her ears, but it was enough to send a shiver through her. "Did you think it would be that easy?" The voice was familiar, chillingly familiar. Her heart stuttered in her chest. She remembered that voice, the one from the shadows. She tried to focus, to bring herself back into the world of the living, but it was like fighting a current, being pulled under. "Do you feel it?" the voice asked again, closer now, like it was right next to her ear. A cold, breathless laugh followed. The air shifted, a faint draft tickling her skin. It was different now. She felt it. A presence. A change. Her eyes fluttered open, though the light was dim, distant. The world was still black, but there were shadows moving, like figures, floating in and out of her vision. Her fingers twitched. "What's happening?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "You're not dead yet," the voice replied, and this time it was unmistakable. It was him. She gasped, the air now filling her lungs in jagged, painful bursts. But she wasn't in the room anymore, not in the place she had fallen. She was somewhere else, somewhere darker. She tried to sit up, but her body felt heavy, sluggish. Everything was hazy. "Why?" she asked again, this time a little stronger, though her voice still trembled with fear. His laughter returned, low and sinister, curling around her like smoke. "You wanted revenge," he said, his voice like a shadow itself. "But you didn't understand." She shook her head, confusion clouding her thoughts. Understand what? The air grew colder still, and the shadows around her seemed to stretch, expand, swallowing the last remnants of light. "You wanted me back," he said, "but I've never truly left. Not really." She shivered, a chill running through her bones. The shadows coiled tighter, wrapping around her like tendrils of darkness. "Now," he whispered, his voice dark and almost mournful, "you're just like me." Her heart stopped. The realization hit her like a slap in the face. No. The darkness around her deepened, the shadows tightening their grip. And then she understood. She wasn't escaping this place. She had become part of it. The weight of the realization crashed down on her, suffocating her. She wasn't just trapped in this endless black void. She was becoming it. Her skin prickled with cold, her fingers trembling as they touched the dark air around her. It was thicker now, almost solid, like she was wading through some kind of viscous liquid. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible, but it echoed in the darkness. Her eyes darted around, but there was no escape, no way out. The shadows clung to her, seeping into her skin, into her very bones. They whispered her name, their voices a constant, maddening hum. "You wanted me back, *," the voice said again, its tone mocking, but laced with something else, something darker. "You wanted to bring me out, to claim me again, *." She shuddered, fighting against the grip of the shadows that tugged at her, pulling her deeper. "No," she cried out, but her words were swallowed by the void. Her legs gave way beneath her, and she crumpled to the ground, if there even was a ground anymore. Everything was indistinguishable, a void of endless black. "You made your choice, *," his voice said, but this time it was distant, as though it was coming from everywhere at once. She wanted to scream, to tear herself away from this place, but the dark held her, tightening around her chest like an iron vise. And then, through the haze of panic, a thought flickered in her mind. Was this him, the man she had once loved, the man she had come to find? Had he been consumed by this darkness long ago? Had she just walked right into his trap? Her heart skipped a beat, but before she could process the thought, she felt it, a sharp tug in her chest. Something cold, something hard. It wasn't just the shadows that were inside her now. It was him. She gasped, her body jerking as the presence of him flooded her mind, suffocating her from the inside. "You wanted me back, *," the voice whispered again, and it wasn't just around her. It was inside her, filling every corner of her being. "But you were never going to save me, *." The darkness pressed in from all sides, suffocating, consuming, pulling her under. She fought, scratched, clawed at the blackness, but it was useless. She could feel it now, feel him. He wasn't dead. He was here, and somehow he was part of this. "Welcome home, *," the voice whispered, the words like poison, coursing through her veins. Her vision blurred, her consciousness slipping away. She was drowning, in darkness, in shadows, in him. And as the final strands of her mind unraveled, she understood. The Desert Kingdom wasn't a place. It was a prison for souls. And she was now one of them. Her breath faltered, fading into the shadows that now enveloped her completely. She no longer had the strength to fight. The darkness wrapped around her like a suffocating shroud, and the cold seeping into her bones was no longer an unfamiliar chill. It was a part of her now, intertwined with every breath she took. Her thoughts became a blur, the boundaries between who she had been and what she was becoming dissolving in the void. The echoes of the man she had loved reverberated in her mind, twisted now, no longer the soft whisper of comfort, but a cruel mockery. "You're just like me now," his voice hummed through her, like a pulse that vibrated in her chest. She couldn't remember who she had been before. All she could feel was him, the darkness inside, filling the hollow spaces in her heart, growing stronger with each passing second. The shadows pressed tighter, and though she wanted to scream, her voice was lost to the endless blackness. Her body felt weightless, as though she were floating, drifting deeper and deeper into the abyss. And then, like a sharp, sudden breath, the ground, if it could be called that, shifted beneath her. The air stirred with a sound, a faint rustle, like dry leaves brushing against one another. Her senses sharpened, as though a distant, forgotten part of her was trying to awaken. Something was changing. The darkness was no longer just suffocating. It was alive. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, swirling around her like a storm. She couldn't make sense of the voices anymore. They twisted into a cacophony of voices, some familiar, others strange. And then she saw it, a light. It flickered faintly in the distance, not the blinding kind, but one that shimmered softly, as though it had been there all along, hidden beneath the layers of darkness. Her body jerked instinctively toward it, but the shadows pulled at her, trying to hold her back. She felt them claw at her skin, pulling her apart, reminding her of her place in this eternal prison. But something inside her resisted, a spark, a tiny fragment of hope that refused to be snuffed out. Her hands reached for the light, trembling. "Come back to me," the voice whispered, closer now, but the words were no longer a command. They were a plea, a hollow echo from the past. No, she thought, her mind clear for a fleeting moment. Asterisk, I won't stay here. I won't become one of you, asterisk. With everything she had left, she fought against the suffocating blackness, clawing toward the light. The shadows screamed, raking at her skin, but she didn't stop. The light grew brighter, clearer, and then, just as her fingers brushed the edge of it, she felt the floor beneath her give way. Not to fall, no, to rise. The darkness around her shattered in an explosion of light and sound, the echoes of the whispers fading to nothing. For a brief moment, everything was quiet, and then she stepped into the light. But it wasn't the end. It was a new beginning. Her body trembled, the weight of the past still clinging to her like a shadow. But she felt the warmth of the light seep into her skin, filling the spaces where the darkness had once been. The man she had come to avenge, to save, he was still out there somewhere, but now she knew the truth. She had freed herself, and in doing so, she had taken the first step toward freeing him. It would be a long road, but she had finally escaped the desert kingdom. She wasn't lost anymore. Not entirely, but even as the warmth of the light enveloped her, she couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness wasn't truly gone. It lingered in the edges of her thoughts, like a shadow just beyond the reach of the sun. She stood there for a long moment, letting the light wash over her, steadying her pulse. The air smelled different, cleaner, fresher. But somewhere, deep inside, she felt a stirring, a pull. The whispers had stopped, yes, but their echo remained in her mind, haunting her, a reminder that this was only a temporary reprieve. She could feel the weight of something still lingering at the back of her consciousness. Is he still out there? She thought, the question gnawing at her. The figure in the darkness. The man she had loved. She remembered his face, twisted in anguish and rage, the last words he'd spoken to her echoing in her ears. He had warned her in that hollow, defeated voice, but it hadn't been enough to stop her. She had tried to save him. She thought she had freed herself, but now she knew she couldn't run from this place. It wasn't just a kingdom, it was a curse, a cycle that drew the lost into its grip, one that didn't let go so easily. She took a step forward, each movement heavy with the realization that she couldn't leave without confronting it fully. The path ahead was uncertain, and every step seemed to stretch longer, more drawn out than it should have been. The light in front of her flickered, dimming, as though hesitant to follow her. But still, She walked on. Suddenly, the air shifted again, this time with purpose. The faint whispering returned, almost as if it had been waiting for her to move. She froze, a chill creeping over her. It's not over. The shadows around her began to shift and twist once more, not quite as dense, but enough to remind her of where she had been. It was pulling her again, and this time she knew she couldn't keep running. The light flickered behind her, the shadows that had once consumed her now creeping at her heels, urging her to turn back. But she couldn't. With a deep breath, she stopped. She stood tall, her resolve hardening. She had come so far, and she was not going to let herself be swallowed by the darkness again. The whispers grew louder, the air colder, but this time she didn't flinch. Her hand tightened around something she hadn't realized she'd been holding on to, something small but strong, a shard of the mirror, the one from the ruin. She raised it in front of her, its edge glowing faintly in the dim light, a reflection of her face staring back at her. "I am not afraid," she whispered to herself, and in that moment she understood. She hadn't come here to save him. She had come to save herself, and in doing so, she would finally break the cycle. The darkness may have tried to claim her, but it had underestimated her. With her head held high, she stepped forward, ready to face whatever lay ahead. No more running. No more fear. The darkness recoiled as she stepped forward, reluctant, hesitant to challenge her resolve. It had never expected her to fight back. It had expected her to succumb, to drown in the whispers, to let her fear consume her. But she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of the shadows, not of the twisted memories, not of the things that lurked in the corners of her mind. She could feel the weight of the shard in her hand, cold and sharp, a reminder of where she had been and where she was going. It pulsed with energy, its reflection in the surface glowing brighter with each step she took, casting fragments of light into the blackness. The path ahead was still uncertain, but she was no longer blind to it. She could see the faint outline of something ahead, a doorway, perhaps, or another passage. But this time, she didn't feel lost. The air around her shifted again, like a gust of wind. A soft, distant whisper snaked through the darkness, but she didn't turn. "Where are you going?" it asked, its voice thin, almost pleading. "Home," she said, her voice steady. Her grip tightened on the shard. "Home," the voice scoffed. "This is your home. You belong to us now. You can't escape. I'm not yours," she said, each word cutting through the air with finality. She moved forward, faster now, her steps more confident. The shadows parted for her, as if unsure whether to obey her will or to challenge her. But the more she moved, the more the darkness seemed to shrink, shrinking back into the corners where it had once thrived. The doorway grew clearer, her heart beat faster, but this time it was from strength, not fear. She could almost feel the pull of something beyond it, something warmer, something that called her back to life. But just as her fingers brushed the edge of the light, something snapped. The shadows closed in violently. Her body was jerked backward, a cold hand grasping her wrist with iron strength. Her heart raced as the figure emerged from the darkness, the very one she had been running from all this time. It was him. His eyes were hollow, the same twisted reflection of the man she had once loved. His face was gaunt, his skin pale and stretched tight against the bones. His mouth curled into that same haunting grin. "You're mine now," he hissed, the words like venom. "I told you, you can't escape." Her breath hitched in her chest as she struggled against his grip, the shadows tightening around her like ropes. "No," she whispered, her voice a trembling defiance. She raised the shard higher, the light from it brighter now, flashing against the darkness. "I'm not yours. I'm mine." With a sharp cry, she thrust the shard toward him. The moment the tip of the shard made contact, everything shattered. The darkness cracked, splintering like glass. The echoes of the whispers were drowned in a deafening roar, a violent storm of light and sound that rattled her to the core. For a brief moment, the world stood still, and then the darkness was gone. The grip on her wrist loosened. She stumbled back, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Before her, the figure, ***, wavered. His twisted grin faltered, and for a brief, fleeting second, his eyes softened. You found your way," he whispered, a trace of something almost like regret in his voice. She stared at him, her chest tight, with a mixture of disbelief and understanding. "I didn't come for you," she said softly. "I came for myself," and with that he faded. The shadows that had once clung to him disintegrated into the air, dissipating like mist in the light. The shard in her hand pulsed once more, then went still. She was free. The light that had beckoned her before was no longer distant. It was real now, tangible. She could feel the warmth of it, the promise of something beyond this place, a place where the darkness could no longer touch her. Her body ached from the weight of the journey, but she felt lighter somehow, as if she had shed a layer of herself that no longer served her. She stepped into the light, and as she did, the world around her shifted again, this time with a sense of finality. The Desert Kingdom was behind her. The cycle was broken, and though the road ahead was unknown, she no longer feared it, because she was no longer a prisoner. She was free. The light washed over her, filling the space around her with warmth and clarity. The weight of the shadows, the whispers, and the endless pressure from before, all of it seemed to dissolve into the air as though it had never been. Her footsteps echoed softly against the ground, but there was no longer any tremor in them, no hesitation. She looked back one last time. The place she had been, where she had been trapped, was no longer there. The darkness had vanished, leaving behind only the memory of its grip. The path before her stretched out wide and clear, bathed in the soft glow of the light that had led her here. It felt like the first true breath she'd taken in ages, like stepping from a storm into calm, fresh air. The air itself had changed. It was warmer now, not oppressive. It smelled of earth and sun, of life, of something real. The world ahead of her felt open, infinite. She walked forward, slowly at first, her eyes tracing the horizon. The landscape ahead was unfamiliar, but it was beautiful. Rolling dunes, trees swaying gently in a breeze that smelled of hope. For the first time, she felt like she was standing on the edge of something new, something possible. She stopped, standing still for a moment, feeling the weight of everything she had endured. The fear, the betrayal, the endless chase through the Desert Kingdom, the shadowed labyrinth of memories. But now it was all behind her. She had broken free. She had chosen to fight, to stand against the darkness, and she had won. But is it truly over? The thought whispered, unbidden. She pushed it away, breathing deeply, feeling the ground solid beneath her feet. No more fear, no more uncertainty. She would move forward, step by step, into whatever this new life had to offer. And then, just as she took another step, the sound of a distant whisper brushed against her ear. Soft, almost imperceptible. "You can't escape forever." Her heart skipped, but she did not turn back. She had faced it all before, and it had no hold on her now. She smiled to herself, the sun warm on her face, her resolve stronger than ever. She wasn't running from anything anymore, and she wasn't alone. The world ahead was hers. The world around her shifted again. But this time, it wasn't the familiar warmth of freedom she had come to expect. Instead, a cold gust of wind swept across the landscape, the sky darkening suddenly as if the sun had been swallowed whole by the very air itself. Her heart skipped a beat. The ground beneath her feet trembled. The light, the one that had been her salvation, flickered. She paused, eyes narrowing, her breath catching in her throat. It's not over. Her mind screamed the words, the nagging truth rising from the pit of her stomach like a bad omen. She had thought she was free, but something was wrong. Deep down, she could feel it, a shift, a presence in the air that wasn't there before. The shadows stretched from the corners of her vision, curling at the edges like hungry tendrils. She stepped back, her pulse quickening. She could hear it now, soft whispers again, curling through the wind. She had thought she left it behind. The voices, the echoes, the things that had tormented her in the desert kingdom. The voices were familiar now, growing louder, clearer. Asterisk, you thought you were free. Asterisk, her breath hitched. Asterisk, you thought you could escape. Asterisk. She spun around, the desert now an endless, shifting landscape, its beauty deceiving. The figure appeared before her. Asterisk, he asterisk. The man she had fought so hard to escape, his hollow eyes still burning with the same twisted fire. Asterisk, you left me once. Asterisk, he said, his voice like ice in her veins. Asterisk, but you can't escape me forever. Asterisk. Her hand went instinctively to the shard in her pocket, but it was gone. The light, the one she had used to break free, it had faded, leaving only the remnants of darkness in its wake. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs felt heavy, trapped. The whispers surrounded her now, oppressive, drowning out her thoughts. Asterisk, you belong here with me. Asterisk. She closed her eyes, fighting to steady her breathing. The air grew colder still. The desert kingdom had never truly let her go. It had only been waiting, and now it was time to claim her again. Asterisk, no. Asterisk, she whispered, more to herself than to him. Asterisk, I'm not yours. Asterisk. The light in her chest flickered weakly, but it flickered, and it was enough. The cold air pressed against her skin like an invisible hand, suffocating, pulling at her resolve. The shadows around her grew heavier, closing in as the figure, asterisk he asterisk, loomed, his presence suffocating, like the very darkness of the desert kingdom had become a part of him. But she stood her ground. She refused to move, refused to be swallowed whole again. I don't belong to you, she whispered, her voice steady now, though every part of her wanted to flee. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, but her spirit was unbroken. The figure, his face twisted in a cruel grin, stepped closer, his eyes glinting with a sinister understanding. Asterisk, you think you can escape? Asterisk, he asked, his voice mocking, yet tinged with a sense of ancient regret. Asterisk, this is who you are. It's always been who you are. Asterisk. She met his gaze, her heart pounding, but this time there was no fear. There was nothing left for him to take from her. No more broken promises, no more unfinished business. She had faced the darkness and had walked through it, not as a victim, but as someone who had learned to survive. Asterisk, no. Asterisk, she said again, this time with more conviction. Asterisk, this is not who I am. I am not your shadow. Asterisk. The air around her shifted. The very ground seemed to breathe beneath her feet, rising and falling in a rhythm she had not known existed. The whispers grew quieter, their power weakening as the figure before her flickered like a fading flame. She closed her eyes for a moment, drawing in a steadying breath, and then there it was, a flicker, a spark of light deep within her chest, the same light that had led her here, that had kept her alive through the darkest hours. With a sudden surge of energy, she raised her hand, palm open, reaching out toward the figure who had once been her love. She focused on that light, pouring every ounce of her will into it. The shadows recoiled. The figure flinched, his twisted form flickering as the light from within her began to tear at the darkness surrounding him. And then, with a final, resounding pulse, the light expanded, overwhelming everything. For a brief moment, the world stood still. And then the desert kingdom, Asterisk, that place of shadows and endless torment asterisk, was gone. The darkness lifted, leaving only the soft glow of the horizon. She stood alone, her chest rising and falling with each breath, but she was no longer trapped in the cycle, no longer lost. The journey had been long, the price heavy, but she was free. And for the first time, she knew it was permanent. As the last remnants of the desert faded into the light, she looked up, and the horizon stretched out before her, open, full of possibility. Her path was ahead, and it was hers to walk,